focus on the Asian American vote and what that means for the US elections. I have Michael Yam with me. He's the NFL anchor and also a quick hits contributor. Thank you so much for joining us, Mike.
Absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to having a meaningful conversation because it is crunch time. We all of a sudden we got an election that's kind of crept up on us. So looking forward to obviously getting a conclusion, which by all accounts actually might take a little bit of time.
So, Peter, since 2000, the Asian American population in the US has grown by more than 70% to about 20 million Asian
Yeah.
Americans who reside in America as of right now. Now, the group, during this time, the number of eligible Asian Americans have also doubled. And I have some statistics here from Pew Research Center that
Sure.
says that by 2055, Asian Americans will be the country's largest immigrant group. About 90 million people have voted so far in the US elections, as we saw,
Yeah.
recently in New York, of course, those pictures, people standing in long lines and waiting for over 6 hours to cast their early votes. This election is a watershed moment in US history. So the first question that I wanted to know was, what exactly is the Asian American voter? What does an Asian American voter look like?
Yeah, that is, I think, $1 million question because I think both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, would love sort of either metrics or a one size fits all. Because right now, and I think the interesting thing is here, because you mentioned sort of this explosive growth, 70% in terms of the Asian American population that has grown since 2000. I think you said it's going to be the largest immigrant group come 2055. What I think is fascinating by that is, the numbers, you have Chinese Americans, you have Indian Americans, Japanese, and the list goes on, and yet you have these communities that are vastly different, and yet it is sort of this generic label that's put on an entire, multiple groups defined as sort of one community, and the needs and the wants and the desires of those specific groups are vastly different. So when you ask me like, hey, what is that profile? I don't think anyone knows. I think you can look at it as sort of like, hey, Indian Americans, generally speaking, might vote one way, or Chinese Americans might vote another way. I think the pollsters, what they're struggling to do, answer this very question, and that is to try to come up with an answer. I think realistically, it really does come down to, if you treat each group separately, you might have a better sense of some of those needs from a political standpoint that some of those communities actually want.
Mike, Asian Americans are the fastest growing electorate in the US today. And, they're
Yeah,
socioeconomically very diverse, but also a very ignored voter bloc as far as the US elections
sure.
go. Do we have a sense of whether Asian Americans vote left or right historically? What does that look like?
Well, I think it's a two different parts here, because I think you're 100% accurate that generally speaking, the Asian American community hasn't been as relevant in the voting, and they have been overlooked because they're not typically actually heading to the ballots to go and cast their vote. I do think those numbers are changing, and I think they're changing because of the youth movement. 400% increase from Asian American voters that are 18 to 29 in this year's election compared to 2016. So I think that's a growing trend and something that you're going to see as younger people get more involved. Right now, look, I'm 39. I wasn't alive for the civil rights movement, but I think at the same time, you read the history books and you watch the movies and you see, and you talk to people that were alive that have dealt with some of these polarizing things that we're still seeing in our society today. I think when you look at what's happening in our country, I don't ever remember a time where it was this divisive. And I think there's a younger demographic that is seeing the same exact thing. And I think they're actually heading to the polls a little bit more. And I think that's going to be a growing trend that you're going to see moving forward here. And I think it's a good trend because, to I think it's disappointing, like from an athletic standpoint, and I know we can talk about this a little bit later, but I'll touch on it now. I've talked to so many athletes and I've seen interviews where professional athletes who are making millions and millions of dollars are now voting for the very first time and have had multiple opportunities in their lifetime to actually go and vote. And I think that's part of the reason. I think you made reference to it when we started. It's over 90 million people right now that have already sent in their ballots. Now, we're dealing with a global pandemic, and I think people are concerned about actually their health and safety going to the actual polls to go and cast their ballot. But generally speaking, I mean, that turnout is more than two-thirds what we saw, in the entire election 4 years ago. And I think right now, like you have these swing states, and I would imagine that that Asian American vote could help decide and be that swing vote in some of those states that are still up for grabs where the margins are so thin. I mean, you take a look at Michigan, 2016. At that point, Hillary Clinton had lost to Trump by about 10,000 votes. You got 50,000 Asian Americans that didn't cast their ballot. You go to Pennsylvania, the numbers even more staggering. I think Hillary lost by about 45,000 votes at that time. You got 100,000 Asian Americans that didn't cast their ballots. So I think as you're seeing more turnout, I think it's a fair assessment, and you can jump to the conclusion that Asian Americans really could help decide this election.
Actually, we have a question right in the comment
Sure.
section, and I mean, I want to see if we can talk about it. I think you did touch upon it, but someone asked, YT Leases, socioeconomically speaking, why are
Yeah.
Asians statistically the most successful amongst all Americans, and how will their vote affect the election, given rich people typically vote right?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think once again, we're using, it's not apples to apples. And I've seen the numbers, and the person who's watching right now that sent in that question, I'm taking a look now, is accurate. I think when you look at the census, typically among minority groups, Asian Americans are the most affluent, and yet I think there's this extreme that you see on both sides, and that is this idea that there is poverty that's there. And I'll take it a step further here. If I'm not mistaken, over the last couple months, and this is not necessarily an Asian American problem. This is a problem that's happening right now in the United States because of shelter in place, lockdowns that have happened, small businesses that can't actually go and thrive. But we're approaching about 300,000 businesses that are owned and operated by Asian Americans that have now shut down because of this pandemic. So I think while the numbers might speak to, hey, Asian Americans are more affluent than some of the other minority groups, I think there's a segment of that population that just simply isn't. And I'm just scrolling back here to make sure I'm sort of answering the question here. Yeah, I mean, look, do I think, I say, hey, rich people typically vote right? Once again, I understand the generalization, but I'd also say in this election over the last couple of years, you look at over the last 3 or 4 months, and hate crimes against Asian Americans are up, almost 900%. I don't know if I have money or if I don't have money, and I can just speak to my own personal take on this. When I leave my apartment in San Francisco, there are times when I think about random acts of violence. And that is something that in my entire life I had never actually thought about. And San Francisco is a highly diverse city, heavy amount of Asian Americans. And, I'm from the East Coast initially, so grew up, I went to school in New York City. I was born in the Bronx. I grew up in really northern New Jersey, but, I got family that's there now. When you have leadership that's in place that's using derogatory terms, and that is in a lot of ways inciting violence, to me, I don't care how much money you have, voting to keep that group in just seems a little irresponsible.
And you said there are hate crimes that have gone up, especially the last 4 years, like you mentioned.
Sure.
You're scared to step out of the apartment. Do you think that is like a big deciding factor for a lot of immigrants, especially because of Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric?
Yeah, I think it's I think, and look, let me rephrase here. Am I scared when I leave my apartment in San Francisco? No. Is it a concern? Is it something that's resonating when I go to the grocery store? Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it a little bit. I used to work at a college sports network that's, roughly a 10-minute walk from where I live. On a Saturday night during college football season, I typically would walk home at 1 in the morning. Never really thought about it. I was on guard a little bit just because of, just normal safety issues. But I got to tell you, if I was doing that walk now, I'd be even more on alert. I probably wouldn't be wearing my AirPods, and I would listen to music and sort of decompress from a long day at the office. I'd be a little concerned about some of those things. But Risha, I'm sorry, I think I might even have missed your question there. But I do think that once again, when we're talking about just going out there and the anti-rhetoric, I think is what you were referring to, what you were asking about. Yeah, I find it hard to believe. And now, once again, broad generalization, because I think when you look at the metrics and you look at the numbers, there's a group of Asian Americans that are undecided. To me, I don't know how. To me, it's an easy decision. I don't know how many people that are out there that are of Asian American descent that aren't concerned right now. I talk to my friends, I talk to family that are thinking about these. I get random text messages from my dad with articles about people that have been attacked just for existing because they are an Asian American. So to me, the anti-rhetoric is just a reason to vote for a change.
And we've seen, like you said, there are concerns among especially people of color, Asian Americans. But it's so interesting, Mike, and the Vietnamese Americans actually vote right, and they are overwhelmingly supporting, as surveys and polls have shown us, they're supporting Trump
Sure.
because they support his anti-China policy because he's very hard on China. What does that mean? Like within the Asian community, you have Vietnamese Americans who are sort of these outliers.
Jay, this is exactly what I was referring to at the start, this one size fits all. And I've been using it during this interview with you, right? Like I'm talking about Asian Americans, and that's sort of the subject of this, but it's not a one size fits all. As you made reference to, Vietnamese Americans are a little bit more right leaning right now and are actually okay with some of the anti-Chinese rhetoric. I think it's really short sighted for a lot of reasons. I think that is sort of a vengeful, hateful way of thinking. And I understand, look, I wasn't around, in the 70s where there's a border war. I don't fully have an appreciation for the tension between those two countries. But what I can tell you is we're all here in the United States, and, there's this old adage, right? Like rising tide lifts all ships. So to me, why not raise every single one of those groups inside the umbrella of Asian Americans? And I got to be honest with you, when I look at some of the articles and some of those hate crimes, not to circle back to this, but generally speaking, it's not always a Chinese American that's getting attacked. There are frontline workers at hospitals that are Indian, that are Korean, that are Japanese, that are facing that same sort of reaction there. And I think, quite honestly, like I don't know how many Americans that are white, for example, will sit there and say, hey, I can tell the difference between someone who's Vietnamese and someone who's Chinese. Like I think the same concern have, and I'm half Chinese, half Italian, some of the concern that individuals in the Chinese American community would have, I would tell you, I think the people in the Vietnamese community in this country should probably have those same concerns.
I want to quickly also talk about Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris
Sure.
is obviously half black and half Indian. And,
Yeah.
there a lot of Indian people from Indian community have talked about her pandering more to her African American voters as opposed to her Indian voters. Although I feel like during this election season, I've seen her sort of also going towards and touching her Indian roots in her conversations. I want to understand what is her role and impact in this election season, given that she is half Indian.
Well, I think it's huge for a lot of reasons, and I won't even go with ethnicity first. I will say female, number one. I mean, during the debates, Joe Biden had made a comment saying that, hey, if I win this nomination, and certainly he did, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to have a female as a running mate. And I think that galvanized a certain group of supporters. Now, clearly in the United States right now, tensions because of a lot of the social issues that this country has faced for decades and really centuries, you can argue, hate and discrimination against African American communities, that's resonating right now. I made reference to the civil rights movement. I think in a lot of ways, 2020, this is, that civil rights movement 2.0 that we're seeing because of the Black Lives Matter movement. To me, I think for Harris, it's about not only trying to galvanize that community, but I also think the female community, and of course, with the heritage that she has, her mom being Indian, I think that's a really important distinction. And getting back to some of these numbers here, I'd look at a state like Pennsylvania. Philadelphia has got about 20% of the Asian American population in that state. So in that city, it's going to be huge. Of that group, the highest segment of the Asian American community is actually Indians. I think it's about, about 150, 155,000 individuals who are Indian, and then the next one is Chinese at about 130. So I think when we talk about that explosive growth that you made reference to, hey, 2055, the largest immigrant population in the United States is going to be Asian Americans. I think there's a strong argument, and if I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I would imagine Indian Americans would actually be the largest group of that Asian American population, and it's not Chinese Americans that are there. So to me, I think it's in a lot of ways, hey, what's important right now, and I do think it's great to have a female leader, and obviously that did not work in the Democrats' favor. You go back to 2016 where the turnout wasn't high for Hillary Clinton. I mean, think about this, like Donald Trump wins Michigan, right, a swing state by about 10,000 votes. Made reference to this before. He got 50,000 Asian Americans who didn't cast a ballot in 2016. Take it a step further, go 4 years prior to that, Obama had won that state by about 400,000 votes. So, we're talking about a massive win for the Democrats 8 years ago, a small victory for Trump and the Republicans 4 years ago. So once again, that delta, I don't know if it's going to be big, I don't know if it's going to be small, but if it is a razor thin margin, hey, 50,000 votes, that could be dramatic in that state if the Asian American population goes out and they do vote for Biden and Harris.
Well, Mike, on November 3rd, we'll see all of the analysis come into, just sort of come
Sure.
into light. I want to get into, since you're a sports expert, we've seen a lot of sports activism lately. Of course, it started with Colin Kaepernick, with, taking a knee for supporting Black lives and sort of standing up against police brutality. We've seen a lot of these, sort of movements, even through a lot of sports events recently. I want to get into that. So NFL and NBA have, been encouraging people to go out and vote. They've also been walking out of playoffs and, basically just taking and supporting Black Lives Matter movement. I want to understand, is that a new sort of development that we've seen where overwhelmingly so many number of sports personalities are taking a stance politically? Is that a new sort of phenomenon?
Yeah, Richa, can you hear me okay? Just want to make sure that I'm coming through.
I can hear you fine.
Okay, good. Sorry, the app had crashed on me there, so I just logged back in. But I think you were asking about athletes, the Black Lives Matter movement, and this being sort of a popular, I shouldn't say popular, but something that we're seeing right now with athletes. Is that the question?
Right. Yeah. Is that a new phenomenon or a development that we see in this election?
Yeah.
With sports
for sure, at least 1,000%. And I think you go back to the 90s, just recently, and I don't know if you got an opportunity to watch The Last Dance, which was a documentary about Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls from the 90s. There was this interesting dynamic there. Michael Jordan, who is still one of the greatest sports icons in the history of this country, and I'd make an argument on the entire planet, didn't take political stances. And I think as time has progressed here, people have been weary of doing that and being a polarizing figure. Politics, is something that does create divides. That's why people don't talk on the dinner table. You don't do it when you're on a first date or any of those types of things. But, we saw this a few years ago with Colin Kaepernick, who took during the national anthem in the NFL. And I think there's a general thought that the NFL, he's not playing and did not get an opportunity after he left the San Francisco 49ers to play again because of his political take. So I think that scared off a lot of athletes who do need to get paid, have a small shelf life in terms of those earning years, and are going to try to make the most of it. I think what we're seeing right now, because of the murder of George Floyd, you're seeing athletes being more than willing to talk about these political issues, and it's becoming something that people don't want to hide from and are being willing to actually go and use their platform. Platforms now are significantly different than they were even 4 or 5 years ago, and certainly 10 or 20 years ago when Jordan was playing. So to me, I do think it's something that we're seeing that is being very much accepted. I have friends that certainly are hardcore Republicans that would tell you, hey, I don't want to tune into a basketball game, tune into an NFL game and see, a protest or someone take a knee. And they look at taking a knee as a protest. And I think that's not exactly the right approach. But in my mind, I think there's a lot of athletes not only willing to use their platform, but understand the power that they have. And I think, taking it a step further, how many times have we seen athletes, post on their Twitter handles, their Instagram? We saw NBA and WNBA athletes would vote on their jerseys. We're seeing record turnout here, and I'm not going to make the complete jump and point to that and say, hey, this is the reason why. But when I see a younger demographic that's coming going to the polls and actually setting those ballots and deciding to vote or sending in their absentee ballot, to me, I can't help but think there's been some influence that they're getting not only from athletes but entertainers as well.
Well, it's good to see involvement from all angles, especially in this really important election in US's history. Thank you so much for joining me, Mike. It was great,
Yeah.
and I hope that our viewers enjoyed the coverage and learned something today.
No, I really appreciate it. And by the way, Rich, I actually just saw a comment from Cameron talking about Abdul Rauf. And yeah, first of all, one of my favorite NBA players who played for the Denver Nuggets, and Cameron says, hey, he took a political stand before this era, and Cameron's 100% right. But I would say, hey, look at what happened to his career after he took that political stand. He was blackballed and never got an opportunity, and he really was one of the best players in the NBA. So I think the difference between what's happening right now and what has happened 10, 15, 20, and at that point, that's got to be early 90s when Abdul Rauf was playing. So, I mean, it was not accepted then, accepted now. Sorry, just wanted to make that point because I saw that comment out there. But
No,
I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. I'm glad that you were able to sort of see that. Okay, thank you again for joining me, and hope to talk to you again.
Absolutely. Take care. Thanks for having me on.